Captain Robert Scott was the British Antarctic explorer, who led an expedition to claim the South Pole in England's honor. However, a simple miscommunication led to frostbite, starvation, and an icy, snow-swept grave. When rescuers found Scott's diary next to his frozen remains, chilling entries revealed his disturbing last moments, but we'll get back to that. Robert Falcon Scott was practically born to be an explorer. By the time of his birth in June 1868, he already had 4 uncles and a grandfather who had served in either the British Navy or the Army. Scott and his younger brother Archie didn't waste any time getting their sea legs. After just 4 years in a day school, Scott found himself in a cram school to become a sailor aboard the HMS Britannia. By July 1883, Scott had earned more stripes as a midshipman. During a race aboard the HMS Rover in St. Kitts, he attracted the eye of someone who would change the course of his life forever, Clements Markham, the secretary of the Royal Geographical Society. Markham was keeping an eye out for skilled young navigators to undertake a daring expedition to the Antarctic. Upon meeting the young but promising Scott, Markham couldn't help but note his intelligence, enthusiasm, and charm. By 1888, Scott was climbing the naval ranks with ease, continuing to pass his exams with near-perfect scores. His clear talents even earned him a coveted spot in the Royal Navy's torpedo training course. Scott's naval career appeared to be on solid ground until he simply vanished from the naval records. For 8 months between 1889 and 1890, there was no record of Scott's highly promising naval career. One historian suggested that Scott's curious absence from official documents at this time was simply because of a reputation-ending scandal, a hush-hush affair with a married American. Allegedly, Scott's higher-ups covered up the affair by destroying the records. In 1897, while serving on HMS Majestic, Scott received devastating news. His father had succumbed to heart disease, plunging his family into crisis. His mother and 2 unmarried sisters now depended entirely on him and his younger brother, Archie. Archie had sacrificed his Army career for a better-paying job to provide for the family as Scott pursued his naval aspirations. But in 1898, typhoid fever claimed Archie, removing his family's last safety net. Now, for Scott, career advancement was no longer just about ambition. It was a desperate financial necessity. Following his family's repeated tragedies, Scott was home on leave in 1899 when fate threw him a lifeline. By sheer chance alone, while walking down a London street, he bumped into an old acquaintance, Clements Markham, who had since become the president of the Royal Geographical Society. Since their first meeting, Markham had put things into motion for an upcoming Antarctic expedition. He was just missing one thing: a captain. A few days later, Scott volunteered himself for command of the Discovery Antarctic expedition. Scott's expedition was ambitious, but there was one little problem. Almost no one on board, including him, had experience in Arctic or Antarctic conditions. Worse still, there was little specialized training before they left. Scott and his team brought dogs and skis to aid their journey across the Antarctic ice and snow, but the brutal conditions proved too much. Disease wiped out scores of Scott's sled dogs in the first season. In 1902, during his first Antarctic winter, Scott learned a painful lesson. The cold would always extract a sacrifice. When a blizzard trapped Scott and his team inside their tent, they had to make a terrible decision: wait it out or push forward. Ultimately, their decision to leave the tent proved fatal. The crewman, George Vince, lost his footing and plunged off a precipice to an icy doom. It's difficult to know what was harsher, the Antarctic elements or Scott's leadership. According to the historical records, Scott ran his expedition like a Royal Navy ship, imposing rigid discipline. Worse yet, when scurvy swept through the crew, many chose to abandon the mission when a relief ship arrived. Still, Scott trudged onward. Scott's great push south was meant to bring glory, but it nearly ended in disaster. Alongside Ernest Shackleton and Edward Wilson, he marched through the barren, snowy wastelands, coming within 530 miles from the sought-after South Pole, before conditions forced him to turn back. The return wasn't much better. Shackleton collapsed from exhaustion, barely making it back alive. When the relief ship arrived, Scott sent him home to recover. By the time he entered his second year in the Antarctic, Scott had turned his sea legs into snow skis. He improved his expedition's techniques, leading to his greatest achievement yet, the discovery of the polar plateau, a vast, untouched expanse of ice. By the end, people were calling it one of the great polar journeys. By 1904, Scott's discovery expedition was over, but the ice wouldn't let him go. The expedition's flagship was frozen in place by unusually stubborn pack ice. It would take 2 relief ships, weeks of struggle, and the use of high explosives to finally break Discovery free, so Scott could return home. Scott arrived back in Britain in September 1904 to a hero's welcome. The public was enthralled by his daring expedition and rapt with tales from the icy edges of the map. Dignitaries and officials showered him with medals, promotions, and international honors. Even King Edward VII was impressed, inviting Scott to Balmoral Castle, where he was personally promoted to Commander of the Royal Victorian Order. Scott's newfound fame launched him into elite social circles. The expedition had taken him from humble naval officer to a celebrity dining with kings, princes, and high-ranking admirals. With his rising status, Scott soon caught the eye of Kathleen Bruce, a brilliant and unconventional sculptor, whose friend group included the likes of Isadora Duncan, Pablo Picasso, and Aleister Crowley. The adventurer and the artist made an unlikely pair, but for Scott, Bruce was about to reshape his life forever. Just as it had in the Antarctic, Scott's persistence paid off. On September 2, 1908, he married Kathleen Bruce at the lavish Hampton Court Palace. A year later, the happy couple welcomed their son, Peter Markham Scott, who would later found the World Wildlife Fund. Despite living in comfort, Scott yearned to return to the Antarctic, and he wasn't the only one. In 1906, when Scott quietly inquired about funding for another expedition, he was blindsided by bad news. His old expedition buddy turned frenemy, Ernest Shackleton, had already launched his own polar bid. Shackleton returned from Antarctica in 1909 as a hero, having come agonizingly close to the South Pole. But his failure was Scott's opportunity. He immediately set plans in motion for his own second expedition. By the end of the year, he had secured command of the British Antarctic Expedition 1910, better known as the Terra Nova Expedition. For his second expedition, Scott wasn't just chasing a lucrative promotion. He was chasing glory for Britain. His expedition prospectus made it clear. The South Pole must belong to the British Empire. His mentor, Clements Markham, noted that Scott had been bitten by the pole mania. But he wasn't the only one racing to the south. In October 1910, Scott arrived in Melbourne, Australia, ready to continue south and claim the pole for England. But an unexpected telegram arrived from a far-flung competitor, Norwegian Roald Amundsen. Beg leave to inform you of Fram, proceeding Antarctic Amundsen. Just like that, Scott learned that Norway was now in the race. Despite Scott's optimism and careful planning, the Terra Nova expedition didn't even reach Antarctica before disaster struck. A violent storm nearly sank the ship. Then it got trapped in pack ice for 20 days, delaying the entire mission. When they finally arrived, one of the motor sledges fell through the ice and sank, taking precious supplies with it. From the moment he arrived in Antarctica, Scott faced brutal weather and adverse conditions. Worse yet, his expedition ponies weren't suited for the bitter cold. That's when Scott made a fateful decision by ignoring Lawrence Oates's advice to slaughter the ponies and move their main supply depot further south. Despite the setbacks and ominous warnings, Scott's confidence only grew during the Antarctic winter of 1911. He even went so far as to say that his expeditionary team had reached as near perfection as experience can direct. After a few outings, he believed that his team was finally ready for the pole. 11 days before his march to the South Pole, Scott issued a crucial order. He instructed his dog driver, Cecil Mears, who was remaining behind, to use his sled teams to intercept and assist the returning polar party on their return journey. It could very well have meant the difference between survival and an icy grave. On November 1st, 1911, Scott finally set off for the South Pole. His caravan consisted of motor sledges, dogs, and ponies, all moving at different speeds and supporting a final group of 4 men who would make the dash for the pole. As planned, support teams turned back one by one until only 2 groups remained for the final stretch. By January 4th, 1912, Scott's team had pushed deeper into the frozen abyss of Antarctica than anyone else, or so they thought. With the end almost in sight, Scott picked his final team to make it to the end. The group included himself, Wilson, Bowers, Oates, and Edgar Evans. After years of planning and months of grueling travel through the snowy wastelands of Antarctica, Scott and his men finally reached the South Pole on January 17, 1912. Sadly, however, they were too late. As the men approached their final destination, they saw a tent. It could only mean one thing. Roald Amundsen had beaten them there, and it turns out by more than a month. With Amundsen's flag fluttering mockingly behind them, Scott and his men began their 862-mile return journey on January 19, 1912. Given their disappointment at reaching the South Pole second, their spirits were low. Scott foresaw a miserable journey, writing, "I'm afraid the return journey is going to be dreadfully tiring and monotonous." The expedition's descent down the Beardmore Glacier proved brutal, and Edgar Evans was the first to fall. Already weak and confused, Evans suffered multiple falls, the worst on February 17th. That night, he collapsed near the glacier's base and never got up. Tragically, Scott's team was forced to abandon him there. Things only worsened for Scott after that. In early March, temperatures unexpectedly plummeted to 40 Fahrenheit, slowing the march to a crawl. In his final letter to Sir Edgar Speyer, Scott wondered if they had overshot the meeting point or if they simply had been abandoned. "We very nearly came through, but lately I haven't felt that we have overshot our mark." The bitter cold and biting winds began to take their toll on Scott and his fellow expeditioners, but none suffered more than Lawrence Oates. His frost-bitten toes turned black, each step more excruciating than the last. Knowing he was slowing them down, he made a fateful choice. On March 16th, he simply told his companions, "I am just going outside and maybe some time." He left their tent, staggered into the storm, and they never saw him again. With frostbite now consuming his own toes, Scott and his 2 remaining men staggered forward for another 20 miles before making their final camp. But there was just a hint of cruel irony in their misery. They were only 12.5 miles from One Ton Depot, where vital supplies, salvation, waited. Sadly, the next day, a ferocious blizzard rolled in and trapped them in their tent. They never emerged. For 9 days, the men lay in their frozen tomb, waiting for a rescue that would never come. Their food ran out, their strength faded, and their letters, once full of hope, recounting their adventures, turned into sad goodbyes. On March 29th, Scott managed one final diary entry, ending with a desperate plea. "Last entry, for God's sake, look after our people." Scott likely took his final breath of Antarctic air on March 29, 1912, though he may have lasted one more day. When rescuers found the tent 8 months later, the body suggested Scott was the last to go, watching his comrades fade before him. In his final journal entry he wrote, "The end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more." Scott never left his beloved Antarctica. Rescuers retrieved his personal belongings as well as some scientific finds from the expedition, then sealed the tent shut beneath the ice. Despite not reaching the South Pole first, and tragically meeting his end, Scott's second Antarctic expedition was remarkably successful. When rescuers arrived, they found 35 pounds of fossils that Scott and his team had painstakingly dragged across the ice, even as they froze and starved. Scott's last recorded words were not of bitterness at meeting such a grisly end, but of acceptance. In his diary, he wrote, "We took risks. We knew we took them. Things have come out against us, and therefore we have no cause for complaint, but bow to the will of Providence, determined still to do our best to the last."